It was a chilly afternoon on the 17th of January, 1944, near the village of Lysyanka, Ukraine. It was around 4 in the afternoon. Oberst-Lieutenant Franz Bäke rubbed his hands for warmth as he observed a ridgeline several hundred meters from his position. Suddenly, something smashed through some low bushes, spilling snow everywhere. Franz knew instinctively what it was, but looked through his binoculars. There, in the distance, he saw the first T-34 tank rush out at speed. Then a second, followed closely by a third. They just kept coming. Soon the ridge opposite the German line was crawling with enemy tanks, their exhaust plumes smearing the pale air. Bäke lowered the glasses. Behind him, the road ran west, choked with wagons, wounded men, gun teams, and straggling infantry struggling to escape the tightening jaws of the Korsun, Cherkassy Pocket. If the Soviets cut this ground, the road would die, and so would everyone on it. He and his handful of panzers were all that stood between the assaulting Soviets and his weary comrades. He stood half exposed in the cupola of his panther, snow settling on his shoulders. So, he said quietly into the throat microphone, they've decided to finish it. His force was thin. Fewer than 40 operational tanks. Crews exhausted, engines worn, ammunition counted shell by shell. Against him, Soviet armored formations advancing with the weight of certainty. They used their typical tactic of rushing headlong towards an objective, regardless of the danger. The obvious choice was to fire early, break the first wave at distance, bleed them before they closed. Bäke rejected it. The terrain ahead was a shallow valley broken by frozen fields, hedgerows, and shallow folds of ground. If he revealed his positions too soon, Soviet artillery would erase them. His dilemma was simple and cruel: fire first and be destroyed by weight, or wait and risk being overrun. He made his choice. He decided to wait at 700 meters, his gunner shifted uneasily. At 600, engines idled louder. The Soviet infantry rode the tanks, crouched low, weapon slung, trusting steel to carry them through. At 500 meters, Bäke instinctively straightened his back. Open fire! The German line came alive in a single violent breath. Panthers and Panzer. Force-punched shells into advancing Soviets. A 75mm shell slammed and penetrated the front of a T-34, making it stop abruptly before it burst into flame. Another had a section of its track blown away, making it slew sideways, track. The smoke of several destroyed T-34s climbed straight up into the cold air. But they kept coming. Other T-34s went around the burning hulks of their comrades and maintaining the momentum of their advance. They fired back. One of the rounds slammed into Bäke's Panther tank with a loud clang, but the shell did not penetrate. Bäke moved constantly, climbing down from one tank onto another, boots slipping on ice. He pointed targets, redirected fire, spoke calmly into radios. Choked with static. A Panzer burned on the right flank, its crew scrambled free. A burst of machine gun fire connected with one of the crew and he fell. Not rising again. A tank commander shouted for permission to pull back. Negative, Bäke replied. Hold. You're covering the road. The concentration of fire broke the back of the Soviet assault. By dusk, the remaining Soviet tanks were beating a hasty retreat. A few more burst into flames as they were hit in their retreat. Wrecks lay scattered across the snow like blackened bones. Bäke breathed a sigh of relief. The corridor remained open. Barely. He knew better than to believe it was over. His own losses were considerable, though not as catastrophic as the Soviet losses. But he knew they could make good there. Losses much easier than German industry could replace theirs. As night fell, the cold deepened. Engines were kept running to prevent freezing. Ammunition was redistributed by hand, men moving silently. Breath steaming, fingers numb. At 22:30, Bäke and his men listened grimly as they were briefed on an intercepted radio traffic. Another Soviet armored group was maneuvering wide, preparing to strike the German right flank before dawn. Bäke had no reserves. He studied the map. By the dim light of a shielded lamp. If he shortened his line now, pulled Back into tighter ground, he could save his tanks. The Soviets would still break through, but later. Too late for the men on the road behind him. The larger dilemma pressed in: save his command or hold the corridor at all costs. Either choice would end lives. He had to choose the one he felt would cost less. Bäke folded the map. "We hold," he said simply. Orders went out. Tanks repositioned in the dark, engines rumbling softly. Infantry dug deeper into frozen ground with hands and bayonets. No one slept. Shortly after midnight, Soviet armored cars' reconnaissance units probed the flank. Bäke led the counterattack himself, 5 tanks surging forward into the darkness. At close range, muzzle flashes strobed like lightning. The Soviet scout stood no chance. Vehicle after vehicle burst into flames as his tanks fired. The Soviets fled in terror, leaving burning vehicles behind. It bought time. But not much. At the break of dawn the next day, the sky cracked open. Soviet artillery slammed into the German positions, shells tearing up frozen earth and hurling splinters of ice and steel through the air. The ground shook. Radios screamed with reports. No sooner than the shells stopped falling when the ground shook again, this time from tracks. Not dozens. Hundreds. Bäke maintained his composure as the radio screamed with the chatter of nervous men. The Soviets advanced in depth, wave after wave of T-34s, engines roaring. Infantry jumping off from them as they got closer to the German lines. This was not a probe. The Soviets wanted a decision. Bäke understood at once, this was meant to crush him completely. He did not wait. All units, advance. Instead of absorbing the blow, the German tanks surged forward into the valley. Distance collapsed. At 300 meters, firing became frantic. At 200, it became savage. Smoke swallowed everything. Snow turned black beneath the tracks. A Panther beside Bäke took a hit and erupted in flame. Another lost its turret ring and slewed helplessly. A Soviet tank slammed into Bäke's Panther, metal shrieking. His driver swerved. The gunner fired instinctively. The T-34 exploded so close the shockwave rocked them backward. Bäke stayed upright, gripping the cupola rim. Left. Now. They fired again. The battle dissolved into chaos. Tanks fought at point-blank range. Infantry scattered, clinging to wrecks, throwing grenades. Engines screamed. Men burned inside steel coffins. Then the worst report came through. Enemy armor, left flank, breaking through. Bäke turned and saw it himself, a column of Soviet tanks racing past the fight, straight toward the road. If they reached it, the corridor slammed shut. He had 6 tanks left that could move. He committed them all. It was a gamble without margin. Smoke swallowed the counterattack. Radio contact vanished. For long minutes, Bäke could only watch the smoke and listen to distant gunfire. Then Soviet tanks began to burn. One by one, black shapes emerged, German tanks, scarred, moving slowly, but alive. The breach closed just short of the road. Bäke allowed himself a few breaths to help maintain his composure. Then he turned to the Soviets in his sector. Bäke dove straight into the fight, his loader and gunner producing a furious rate of fire. The crew moved as one. He would say in a flat tone of voice, "Target, front. Fire when ready." His gunner would yell firing in the loudspeaker before the Panther's massive 75mm cannon would lurch back, sending a shell that smashed through a T-34's frontal armor. The professionalism and skill of the German panzer crews were telling. By midday, the valley fell silent except for the crackle of fires and the ticking of cooling engines. Snow began to fall again, soft and quiet, settling over wreckage and bodies alike. The ground was unrecognizable. Burning hulks of tanks, both Soviet and German, were everywhere. Bäke's force was shattered. Fewer than half his tanks remained operational. Crews moved like old men, faces hollow, eyes rimmed red from cold and exhaustion. But the road was still open. German columns streamed westward, wounded men supported by comrades, guns dragged by horses too tired to lift their heads. They passed under the guns Bäke had held, and they kept moving. Bäke watched them go, silent, hands resting on the rim of his cupola. There was no celebration. Only relief, and the knowledge that although the Soviets were thrown back in this sector, they would come again in force. That night, as repairs were made and names quietly crossed off lists, snow covered the scars of the valley. It was not victory, but it was survival. Bäke, and what remained of his men, lived to fight another day. For his actions in the Korsun Cherkassy Pocket, he was awarded the swords to the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. Oberstleutnant Franz Bäke survived the war, and passed away on the 12th of December, 1978, aged 80. Please like and subscribe for more.